everyone, and welcome to the Becoming an Empowered Parent online series, offering expert tools for embracing imperfection, building connection, and creating more peace and joy within your family. I'm so happy that you're here. I'm your host, Debbie Zeichner. I'm a parent coach, a mindfulness facilitator, and a licensed clinical social worker. And today I'm absolutely excited and thrilled to be joined by my friend and pediatric dietitian, Rachel Rothman. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Debbie. I'm so excited to chat with you.
Oh, and I'm so excited that you're here. So before we dive into today's very juicy and important topic on reducing stress and increasing confidence while feeding your little ones, I wanted to share a bit more about Rachel with you. Rachel is a pediatric dietitian and feeding expert specializing in working with children and families. She helps parents and caregivers feel less stressed and more empowered when it comes to feeding their children. Rachel owns a private nutrition practice, Nutrition in Bloom, where she works with children and families to provide feeding guidance and evidence-based nutrition recommendations. Rachel teaches infant and toddler feeding classes throughout San Diego County and online. She's got some fantastic stuff. We'll talk later about how you can find her and check her out. So again, Rachel, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Rachel and I met several years ago. I can't remember how many it is right now. I'm not even going to stop to count, but we met several years ago at a Moms on Maternity, which is another fantastic organization. And we were both speaking. And I just felt this instant connection to Rachel. Rachel just has this way about her. She was so warm and so engaging. And I absolutely loved the work that she was doing to really support parents in creating these peaceful meal times. Because I've seen, gosh, just throughout my whole career as a therapist, you know, the earlier that we start these healthy ways of being healthy, developing that healthy relationship with food can just really carry and last a lifetime. So I just have just such an interest in and share this passion for what she's doing, and just so happy to have you here.
Thank you. And I will say the same goes for you when we met. And I was just so excited to connect with you at the time. I think my youngest was just a couple months old, and my older daughter was about 2.5, and we were having a lot of kind of parenting challenges. So it was so nice to connect with you and to be able to really get your support from the beginning of my parenting journey too.
Thank you, Rach. Well, so before we dive in today, we'd love to hear a little bit more about you. So I'm wondering if you could just share a bit about your journey and how you got into this work.
Sure. And I could talk about this forever, so I will try to be brief, but
that's okay.
I honestly think that my journey to become a dietitian started when I was a child, and growing up with not the best relationship with food. And I'm sure that a lot of people watching might be able to relate, but really just growing up in a time when low fat was popular and dieting, and really being told at an early age that I was overweight, that I needed to lose weight. And I think that a lot of that really created this just unhealthy relationship growing up. And it really took many years into adulthood, my early adulthood, to really heal that relationship with food and really be able to trust my body and have that confidence that I so desperately wanted. And I feel like my passion really started because of that. And now I do what I do because I want children not to have to go through that, to be able to really establish that healthy relationship with food early on. And I also don't think it's intuitive. I don't think as parents it's really easy to figure that out. So and then we're dealing with behavior stuff with feeding and picky eating and all of this stuff. So I feel that my job is to not necessarily, to help the kids, but also help the parents kind of figure out how to make feeding easy, and so they can foster this healthy relationship in food with their kids.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much education that goes along with this, right? That our parents didn't have, right? It was kind of one fad diet after the next.
Yes. And
when you're exposed to that and that's what you're raised with, that's what you tend to bring with you into the relationship now in feeding your own children. So I could see, so you've really lived this, and, you know, so obviously have so much to share and so much wisdom. So let's dive in. So you mentioned picky eating. I think we got to start there, right? I mean, I think that is the question that I know I'm asked often in my coaching practice. I know you're asked this question all the time. And just, that question of what to do with a picky eater. And I have to say one thing about this, just from a personal level. I know that that word is a very common term. And I know, when my daughter was young, and even to this day, I would say she would definitely be one that would be classified as picky. And I remember and I don't know if you feel like this, but I just got really sensitive to that word, that when people would call her that, I was so conscious of her not seeing herself as picky, because I knew or was even fearful of then her internalizing that and then actually taking on a life of its own. So I wonder if you could say a little, like before we even go there, like if you could say anything about that. Do you find in your practice, do you see that same experience of kind of putting these labels on kids, especially around food and eating?
Yes, definitely. And I've actually done quite a bit of content around this because I think it's so important with picky eater or good eater or bad eater. All of these terms, and I think from like a parenting perspective, I'm sure you see it as well, this kind of pigeonholing and labeling kids. And I really invite parents to try to just kind of take those terms away and not talk about them, because it becomes that self-fulfilling prophecy, right? When kids hear they're a picky eater, that's what they're going to internalize. So I've worked with families where the kids will say, well, I don't eat that because I'm a picky eater.
Right.
So they start to just get that in their head. So definitely trying to take those labels out of it. I try to use the term selective eater quite often because I find that the connotation there just isn't as polarizing maybe as picky eater. But I think that it's important to think about that, because as parents, we can definitely pigeonhole our kids, and then they tend to take that on. It kind of reminds me of a lot of times when kids say, well, I don't eat that. We say, well, you don't eat that yet. Or she doesn't like that. She doesn't like that yet. Or you can't do that yet, from like a parenting perspective. So trying to just kind of open the doors and not really trying to get into those labels. So yeah, that's a really good point.
And it keeps that door open, exactly as you said. And I remember that parents would say, because we'd go to somebody's house and my daughter was only eating certain foods. And so my friends would even comment, oh, she's such a picky eater. And I would always say, I think she's just learning to try new things.
Yeah.
It's a process. That. And the yet is, so, she hasn't tried that yet.
Yeah.
And she's learning, even now to this day, now she's 11, and there's definitely things that she won't eat. And yet little by little, we're starting to, increase the amount that she's eating, but just it's happening naturally and organically, which I think is so great. So for those parents who are struggling with this, who have kiddos who are more selective in their eating or are reluctant to try some new foods, what suggestions do you have for them?
Yes.
Oh, yes. And then I have a follow-up question now, but let's start there.
Yeah. And just to your point about like going to people's houses and being with other people, I think that sometimes that comparison can be really hard too, and seeing what other people are doing. I work with a lot of clients that have this kind of guilt around their kid versus their friend's kid. So really trying, and I mean, much easier said than done, but like tuning everything out and figuring out where you are, because that's what's going to make the most importance, and you're going to make the most progress from where your starting point, because it's going to be different for everyone, right? Like every child learns to walk at different times, or just, learns to read at different times. So I think if parents can kind of maybe shift that mindset a little bit of like their child. So I think that's really important.
And themselves, I'll just say quickly, because I remember, and I'm sure you have this, there's some parents who are, which is beautiful. I mean, hand making every single meal, everything's made from scratch, just the amount of time, and as a result, what those children will eat. But for some parents, they may not have the time to make a gourmet home cooked meal for every meal, and that's okay. And for those that are able to do it, that's beautiful, right? So I think it's not only about comparing kids, but do you find that too, that sometimes we as parents will look at what another parent's doing and think, oh no, I'm totally screwing this up, and what am I doing?
Yes, totally. And so often like the selective eating, it has nothing to do with how you've been feeding your kids, or, you know, nothing to do with that. And I think a lot of times parents sometimes internalize that and feel guilty that they've caused this. And I really try to, you know, invite parents to think like, it's not, this is who your child is. And I see with, a lot of the more strong-willed or more, or kids who are a little more, I don't know, what's another word for strong-willed? Just more like assertive or kind of like stand up. Sometimes they tend to be a little more selective because they have stronger opinions.
Yeah.
So it's a lot, I find that a lot of this comes just from your child's personality, and it's not from anything that you've done. And I think that everybody has different beliefs when it comes to parenting and different ideals of what matters to them. So find what matters to you and then kind of go with that and do what works for you, not what works for everybody else. So
Rachel, can you say a little bit developmentally what is going on during the stage where kids tend to become more selective? I notice even now I'm like trying not to use the word, right? Because I really want to shift the mindset around that. But what's happening developmentally?
Yeah. So usually kind of that more selective, more picky phase tends to come up usually around between like a year and 18 months to 2 years. And there's so much that's going on developmentally. And actually from a developmental standpoint, it's great. Kids are becoming more independent. They're realizing that they have likes and dislikes. They have autonomy. They have, you know, they're testing us where they're seeing like, what can I kind of control and not control? And all of those things together, they're learning new language. They're learning words. No is always a common, you know, favorite word for a child. And all of these things together so often can lead to that more selective behavior where when we start feeding them around 6 months, they're usually willing to try most foods and they're willing to kind of eat most things. And then they kind of realize that they have these opinions and can make changes. So it's very, very normal from a developmental standpoint. And they're still learning. They're still kind of learning about food. I think so often, sometimes when I get frustrated with my little one, so I have an almost 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, I sometimes think like, okay, she's only been on this planet for 2.5 years. Like I can't, you know, I have to kind of like take it down a notch and realize that. And I think when it comes to feeding, that's a really important point too, is that our kids they're still learning to eat too. Usually it's not until kids are 3 years old that they actually develop all of the oral motor skills and know, you know, how to chew, how to swallow, how to do everything, and really how to eat like we eat as adults. So I think that's a really important point to remember, that it is very normal developmentally, and they're not trying to, you know, they're not trying to defy us or to do anything. It's just what happens. So yeah,
it's just a normal part of their development. So when parents think or wonder, is there something wrong with my child, or he or she's not eating this or that, it's something to know that's really healthy and a normal part in that. And it is, it's that toddler kind of willfulness, right? That no, and being able to assert themselves and really express their autonomy in that way, which is so important for their development. We want them to be able to do that. So is there any specific tools or suggestions that you offer to parents whose kids are really resistant to trying new things? Is there anything, you know, I know one parent will say, my child won't eat vegetables. How do I get them to eat vegetables? So are there any suggestions that you've found to be really useful in helping kids kind of open up to new foods?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. The first thing, I think it actually has to do more with adults than kids, but to really think about short-term and long-term goals. So short-term goals might be, we want our kids to be meeting their nutrition needs, to be growing, to be gaining weight adequately. But they might be doing that without vegetables or without eating meat. So I, in my private practice, when I meet with a client one-on-one, I have them fill out a food record. So I keep track of their intake for a few days. I analyze vitamins and minerals. And a lot of time, if a child's maybe eating fruit, a variety of fruit, but not vegetables, they're still meeting their nutrition needs. If they're, let's say, drinking milk, maybe eating cheese and yogurt, they might be meeting their protein needs. So I think that first step is the short-term goal, where the long-term goal is wanting them to be eating vegetables or meats or whatever else it might be. And we don't do that by pressuring them or forcing them or bribing them, because those are all short-term solutions that might or might not work in the short term. However, we're not teaching them that healthy relationship with food, meaning we want them to like the vegetables, right? We want them to eventually eat the vegetables. So if we say to them, well, you can't have your dessert until you eat your broccoli, like that's really saying, oh, my broccoli is bad then if I have to eat it to get this. Mm-hmm. So it's really thinking about that long-term, the long-term goal of them eating the vegetables and hopefully eating the vegetables on their own without us to bribe them. Does that piece make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And like you're saying, I think that we put so much pressure on ourselves about what healthy eating means and the importance of healthy eating. And that pressure, it's oftentimes can backfire on us, right? Because then sometimes our kids become even more resistant. And then there's these negative associations that are made, right? Like you said, between a vegetable, which is something that's healthy, and something that they have to do. So it reminds me of the 1 more bite or 5 more bites. Can you say anything about your thoughts on you need to take 5 more bites?
Yes. I think that sometimes as parents, we get kind of stuck in this way of thinking, well, my child needs to eat 5 bites of this or 3 bites of this to be meeting their needs. But what does that 3 bites really have in it? Does it really have the, vitamin C that a child needs or whatever we think they need? So we're putting pressure on them, and maybe they'll do it, and maybe they'll do it willingly. But again, it's not getting them to that goal of eating the vegetables on their own. Mm-hmm. So what I think is the most important thing is going to be, first of all, exposure. So exposure to the foods. Mm-hmm. And what I talk a lot about is, instead of pressuring, I talk about encouragement. Mm-hmm. And not necessarily encouragement in the form of pressure, because sometimes it's a little hard to decipher, but talking about the food. So I always use broccoli as my example for some reason, but instead of eat 3 more bites of this broccoli because, take 3 more bites, or just try it, I know you'll like it. That's a lot of times the words that I hear. So instead of that, thinking about encouraging. So maybe the parent picks it up and smells the broccoli, like, oh, what does this smell like? How does it smell to you? Or kind of touching the broccoli, like, ooh, this feels bumpy on my fingers. How does it feel to you? So kids usually, there's a lot of research been done on kids trying new foods, and it shows that it usually takes maybe 10, 15, even 20 exposures of a new food before a child's actually going to eat it. Mm-hmm. So what's important to think about with those exposures is encouraging interactions with that food. So if a child's not yet eating a food, but maybe they touch it, and then the next time you give it to them, they smell it, and then they put it to their mouth or they lick it, those are all these baby steps to getting them to eat the food. And that's going to be the most important piece.
And that's so much about, I know in your field, it's intuitive eating, and in mindfulness, it's mindful eating, right? Yeah. It's engaging with the food, it's interacting, it's getting curious. So you're creating this whole connection with food in such a different way, right? Where it's not just something that we do without thinking about it, but we actually really get curious about it. And for kids to learn that at 2 years old and 3 years old, and what color is it? What does it taste like? What is the texture? That's a lifelong practice, which Definitely. Is an amazing, incredible opportunity that we have, right? Yeah. When we really stop to look at it and shift our perspective in that way, it's huge.
Yes. And what you mentioned about like mindful or intuitive eating, like really trusting your own body, kids naturally have this wonderful way to regulate their intake. They know when they're hungry, they eat when they're full. We think about infants. When they're born, we feed them on demand, right? We feed them, they tell us when they're done. And kids have that ability. So when we say to them, eat 2 more bites or eat 3 more bites or finish this, we're disrupting that mechanism, that hunger and satiety mechanism, and almost teaching them not really to trust themselves and to trust their body. So when we can really let go of that pressure and help them to trust their own body, it's going to be the best result in the long term.
Trusting their own body and not needing to please us, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So when you talk about exposure to new foods, one of the things that I know we've talked about this before, and I love talking with parents about, is the idea of a family meal. Yes. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that, about involving kids in the process and what that looks like, what you share with parents.
Yeah, I think that family meals are going to be more important than what you're actually serving, is being together as a family. And
actually, Rach, let me clarify really. When I say family meal, I mean family style.
okay.
So yeah, like family style where it's not just each kid is served. That's what I meant to say, in case for parents who can't always have a family meal together, but just say that idea of family style. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you.
Family style. And even I am just going to touch on like having a meal as a family. I feel like sometimes there is this pressure that we need to be all eating together and having family meals. And if you can sit with your family, it's great. And I know, though, it can be really hard with working parents and everybody's on a different schedule. So even if it's like sitting together and having a snack, or even if it's like a weekend, breakfast, or it doesn't necessarily have to be dinner. It's what works best for you, and what being present during that meal is also important. So that's kind of that family meal. And it also, when you are eating with your child, that modeling really helps too. That's another great way that they're going to learn to kind of eat as well. But with family style meals, so family style, and what we mean by that is, instead of plating the food for the kids, you put the rice on the table and the green beans on the table and everything on the table, and then kind of pass it around and everybody sort of takes their own, which is an approach that I absolutely love, especially for the more selective eaters, because even if they don't take anything on their plate, even if they're resistant, you might ask them to pass something, maybe pass the green beans from one member to the next. So they pick up the bowl, it's going in front of their face, they're smelling it a little bit, and then they're passing it. So those are the interactions that are going to get them closer to eating the food. Even though for us as adults, I think that sometimes intuitively it sounds like, well, eating it is my goal, but no, it's all these baby steps to actually eating the food that's going to be the real goal and the real progress.
Yeah, it's that long term, like you said, right?
Exactly.
It's the long term goal. Absolutely. So speaking of having these family meals and doing this family style, let's talk about, because I know another big struggle I hear about often is kids sitting still for a meal. So kids sitting at the table, not sitting still at the table when it's mealtime. And I know parents get really, really concerned about that. So I was wondering what suggestions you have for that.
Yes. And I will say, Debbie, I know you talk about like the behavior stuff too. So I know you have a lot of good tips here too. So I think there's a few things. I think number one is, what are your expectations? So what are your expectations for your child to be sitting still? Sometimes young kids, they can only sit still for a couple of minutes and then they leave. And my advice for that is, honestly, if they seem like they're done, let them be done with the meal. I never, especially with the younger kids, want them to feel the pressure to just sit there, because that's when these behaviors come. However, I will say with that is that when they get up from the table, that's the end of their mealtime, versus letting them get up from the table, running around a little bit, and then coming back. So I think about, which I know you talk about too, is really like setting those limits, but being those respectful limits, where if you're all done at the table, like, that's fine, you can get up. However, mom and dad are still sitting at the table. We're still enjoying our food. You can go do what you want to do. You can take your dish to the table, using polite manners, but you can't come back to the table to do what you need to do. So does that make sense?
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, like you said, it's about creating those boundaries and those limits that developmentally some kids can't sit still. I mean, I remember when my kids were young, we would go to restaurants and they would have a complete fit. And we kept trying and trying. And finally, I'm like, why am I doing this? Like, why am I doing this to myself? Why am I putting my kids through this? And why am I putting everybody else through that? So we just had to take a restaurant hiatus for a while until we could try again, right? And I think it's the same, that we have to remind ourselves that maybe at these young ages, 2 or 3, or for some kids, even 4-year-olds have difficulty sitting still. And it's not going to be like that forever. It's not like you're going to have a child who's up and down, running around the house all over for the rest of their lives. That's not going to happen. They will get there. And it goes back to the yet, right? They're just not there yet, which I love.
Yeah, I think that sometimes, like, I've noticed this with just parenting in general, is sometimes when you're going through a phase, you feel so stuck in that phase and you feel like it is never going to end and it's been going on forever. But really, you are going to make it through that. So the more that you can kind of realize, even just with the picky eating in general, you know, it is going to be a phase. And yes, some kids are more selective and some might need some outside help or might need a little more guidance, but kind of realizing that you can kind of get through that. Okay, I'll help, sweetie, when I'm done. I'll let you watch the video, okay? Can you just keep watching it? Okay.
So you know what, Rachel, that brings up a good question. So when do you think that it's time for when would a parent seek outside help? What would you say, as far as like if they're noticing maybe some sensory issues? But when would you think that it is worth having a consultation to address some of these feeding issues?
I would say when you notice that your child's eating is starting to become very selective, where maybe they only have maybe like 5 to 10 foods total that they'll eat, or maybe the behavior challenges have really just gotten outside of your control, where you're like, I need somebody else to come kind of give me some guidance. Or I do work with a lot of kids that are very rigid in terms of their feeding behavior. So they'll only eat one brand of one food, you know, and it has to be this specific package. And sometimes it is related to some kind of sensory challenge, which I think more and more people are realizing now. But before, when we thought about sensory, we thought about touch or smell, and we didn't really think about how feeding plays such a role in sensory, the way the food feels in our mouth, the way it goes down, the smell of it. So a lot of kids who do maybe have, who are hypersensitive or hyposensitive, they might have, feeding might be challenging. So, and definitely people are welcome to contact me. And there's this whole world of feeding therapy where you can really get answers and kind of have your child work through some of this stuff to slowly get them to where you want them to be.
Yeah. I mean, it's, and there's so many parents who are going through this right now. This is something that is so common that it's just nice to know that there's so many things that we can try on our own, and that it's perfectly okay to seek out the support of a professional like yourself who can really just give some guidance. And sometimes it's a couple of things that a couple of tweaks that can be made, which can change everything. Or sometimes kids need to work with somebody individually for a short amount of time. And I don't know if you find this too, but sometimes when our kids hear it from somebody else other than us, it can really make a huge difference too, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, totally agree, especially with just some of those little tweaks. Even with what you mentioned with kids not sitting at the table, sometimes I find at dinner time, maybe a child has just had a snack like 30 minutes before, and it was a big snack. So of course they're not going to be hungry. So even just like making a little tweak in your schedule where maybe you have snack a little bit earlier, or you just kind of change a few things. Sometimes it's amazing how just these little tweaks can make a huge difference in everything. So.
One of the other questions I know that comes up often that I wanted to have you share about is throwing food, those kind of behavioral things, throwing food. What do you say to parents who may be dealing? I always see them go hand in hand with the not sitting still, right? They like the not sitting still and the throwing food. Any suggestions that you have for parents who might have kiddos that are throwing their food?
And I think it is kind of similar to the not sitting still, and it is developmentally, they throw food, you get agitated, they're getting a reaction out of you. So if you can, not have a reaction and trying to like take it in stride, but also use something similar to the sitting still. So if they are, throwing food, what I like to say is, and I'll use my daughter Sydney's name, Sydney, we don't throw food. When you're throwing food, you're showing me that you're all done. Are you all done? And, they might say yes, they might say no, they might be too young. So saying it again. And then if they continue doing it, okay, your meal time is over now. You're showing me that you're all done, taking them from the table. And yes, you'll probably be met with a not happy child. And this happened to me, actually. My daughter, Sydney, she would stand on her chair. So it wasn't throwing food, but standing on her chair. So we let her know. And it honestly took one time of her getting down, I'm so hungry, and that's so hard as a parent to hear, right? But then she never did it again. Like being firm and sticking to those respectful limits is really important too. So, not giving them the reaction they want, either picking it up, putting it back, And the throwing food, I will say, I definitely think it's usually a phase, and they usually grow out of it relatively quickly. It's just kind of getting them through that. I know I hear a lot of families with dogs, same thing, where the child, like, it's so much fun to feed the dog, right?
Yes, that just came up actually. Yeah.
Really? So a lot of times I say, okay, can you put your dog in your crate for, like just during mealtime, or, trying to just make these small tweaks and small changes to being aware of what they need, but being also aware of what you need, and making sure that those two things are going hand in hand together.
Yeah, absolutely. And setting those expectations, like you said, like what is okay, right? Where does food go? Food stays on the plate, right? Letting them know what's okay. So Rachel, in our last few minutes together, do you have any other tips or tools or strategies or parting words of wisdom that you want to share with our listeners and our viewers?
I think that recently what I've been talking about is my biggest thing is let go of expectations and let go of your agenda. I think that, things, we want our child to be eating a certain way. We want to control what they're eating because we want them to be healthy. Like it's coming from a good place, but ultimately our child is the one who's going to put food in their body. We are not going to be doing it for them. So the more that we can let go of our feeding agenda and really be feeding from a place of trust and no pressure, and it not only our children are going to kind of let go of that anxiety, but I find that it's almost like liberating to just kind of say, okay, I'm going to serve the food. Like you as a parent, you're still responsible for what, so you're going to put the food out, but then let your child decide if they're going to eat that food, and if they're not going to eat that food. And it's okay, whatever happens, to really think about feeding. One meal doesn't make a difference in the nutritional status of your child. It's this long-term nutritional status. So really, I hope parents, what they come away with is just letting go of that pressure of their child needing to do something so that the parent feels better, and then hopefully the child feels better too.
And it's amazing what happens as a result of that too, right? Once we take the pressure off of ourselves, our kids feel less stressed and less pressure. And then that's when mealtime feels so much more enjoyable, because there's not the stress that's associated. Because I always say to parents, when we put so much pressure on ourselves and on our children, that creates stress. And when you're stressed, kids don't want to eat when they're stressed, right? They just, then it becomes this vicious cycle that they get into. So that was so helpful, Rachel. Thank you so much for all of these tips and tools and insights. I think you shared so much with us today, and you are so gracious and generous in offering our viewers and listeners a free gift. I'm just wondering if you wanted to say anything about what you're offering.
So it's more about trying new foods. So if that's something that you're working on, it's a guide. It's my free guide called 4 Steps to helping your child try new foods. And it's a lot of what we talked about, but really coming up with a plan of taking that pressure off, and how we can encourage our child to try new foods and get them on that path, help parents feel more empowered, less stressed, and help their child try new foods. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel. So how can people find you? How can people follow you?
Yeah. So my business, it's Nutrition in Bloom, and that's my website, nutritioninbloom.com. I have a blog with a lot of feeding tips, a lot of great child-friendly recipes. It's on my website. I'm on Instagram, nutrition.in.bloom, Facebook as well, under the same name. And I also have a Facebook group that I started relatively recently, just for support, for recipes, for feeding advice. So it's a great community and a great place where a lot of people have come together to just chat about feeding their kids.
Yeah, and it's such a common struggle, I know, for so many. So thank you for the amazing work that you do.
Thank you,
I'm so grateful that you were able to be with us today and share all of these helpful suggestions for parents. And parents, I really want you to think about your takeaways from today. Really let this sit with you and land, and think about some of your biggest takeaways, write them down in your journal, and maybe 1 or 2 things that you want to commit to, even just one thing that you want to commit to trying based on what you learned from Rachel today. So again, Rachel, thank you so much for being with us. Thank each and every one of you for being here today. And I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow for another day of the Becoming an Empowered Parent Summit. So bye for now. Take care.
Bye.